Well, we're live. Welcome, everyone. I'm here with Ariel from FY NYTH. She lives off grid in a tiny home, and I actually got exposed to you, Ariel, um, not too long ago. You did an episode, you were on the Survival podcast talking about composting toilet. I'm sure you recall that, but
I do.
yeah, that was an interesting episode, and that's at the point where I decided, wow, your lifestyle is pretty awesome, and I checked out your YouTube channel and decided that I'd start following you from that point. But I've been following your journey ever since, and
Oh, cool.
yeah, I thought I'd bring you on and introduce you to the audience. So first off, just why don't you introduce yourself and give a little bit of your backstory and how you got to where you are today?
Okay, well, thanks for having me here. I'm Ariel. I live in a little tiny house. That's what I'm sitting in right now. I can almost touch both walls at the same time. It's on wheels, just under 160 square feet. I've been living in it for, I guess I'm in year 9 now. And for most of that time, it was parked in a little clearing in the woods on the side of the mountain here in Wyoming, where I live, on somebody else's ranch. And I traded some work to the ranch owners in exchange for being able to park my house there. And then I guess almost a year and a half ago now, I got married, and my husband and I bought our own little acreage and rolled the tiny house on wheels onto it. So now it's in a new spot. That's the advantage of having your house on wheels. And so now we're in a slightly different spot, still tucked into the Wyoming mountains. And we're just kind of working on building our own stuff here, all the infrastructure and such that didn't make any sense to do when it was someone else's property where I knew I wouldn't be staying forever. We've got chickens and ducks and honeybees and dogs and cats and a garden, and we're hopefully going to build a small house that's a little bit bigger for 2 people, hopefully starting this. That's kind of how I got here.
Yeah, nice. Now, as I understand, you used to be weren't you in the Pacific Northwest?
No,
Where were you originally when you first got your tiny house up and running?
I've been in Wyoming the whole time with the tiny house. I did grow up in Pennsylvania and Amish country there, but when I was 20, I moved west, and I have been in Wyoming ever since. And I was in a much more treed spot tucked into the side of the mountain, so it probably looked a little more like the Pacific Northwest. Now we're just down off the mountainside enough into the valley that there's not big, thick trees around us anymore. But this tiny house has been in Wyoming ever since the day I moved in.
Right. When did you get the idea? What was the thing that, like, because I'm sure you didn't always live in a tiny house. What was the impetus for, making that transition?
Being homeless. I had been living in Wyoming for quite a few years at that point. I'd been in various rentals. A good friend and I had been roommates for quite a while at that point. The house she and I were renting at the time, the owners sold it, and the new owners were moving in, so we couldn't stay. And at that point, rents had just gotten really crazy in the area, and we were looking for something else, that we could rent, and there was just nothing that wasn't more than like 100% of our combined income. So I was trying to figure out, what do I do? Do I, just move completely out of the area, start a life somewhere different? Because tucked in the mountains here and in Wyoming, there's a lot of public land. There's a lot of national parks and national forest and Bureau of Land Management, BLM land, and so on. So you can't just move another like mile out of town. There's a town, and then everything is wild around it. And then several hours later, there's another town. So you can't just move a little bit further out. So it kind of either you're there or you're not there. And I didn't really want to completely leave the area, and, all of my friends and my job at the time and everything that I had built there, even though I'd moved to a totally new area before. When I left Pennsylvania, I didn't know anybody in Wyoming, but I wanted to stay. So I decided that probably the most reasonable way I could do that would be to get some kind of van and do a conversion to be able to live in that. I've always been pretty comfortable in small spaces. I've done long road trips in a car. I've backpacked, many weeks living out of, but I can carry on my back and such. So I was like, I think I can do that. That'll be, something that will be fine for until I figure out something else. And so in the process of looking at conversions on, van life and such, I bumped into, I don't even know who it was. There was some article on, this teenager who built a mortgage-free house in his parents' backyard, and it was what we now call a tiny house on wheels. That was not something I'd ever heard of at that point. And I was like, in this cold, snowy climate where it's winter 8 months a year, I think something built like an actual house, with insulation and walls and an actual roof and stuff, that sounds like it would be way more comfortable. So I started kind of looking at options down that road. And at that time, most people, if you said tiny house, they were like, what? Now when you said, they're like, oh, like the cute TV shows. But nobody had ever heard of it then. Or not most people. And there was only 2 builders I could find in the whole country that were not just providing plans for you to build it, but building your own. I didn't currently have the skills to build a house, and I was going to be homeless in a few weeks. So I knew I was going to need one built for me. And the closest one of those was in Colorado. So I had some back and forth with them about what exactly I wanted, and they built it. And I was on a little bit of a wait list on their schedule at the time. And then this went from a flatbed steel trailer to a completed house ready to move into in 6 days. And they towed it up to Wyoming, and I've been living in here ever since.
Yeah, very cool. As I understand it, you've got like crazy good insulation in that tiny house, right?
Yeah, it's actually the spray urethane, that closed cell spray foam, which if you have a building on wheels, that's helpful also because it kind of locks everything together compared to other insulation methods. Now, she hasn't moved much. She's moved from Colorado to there, from that spot to here, and may never move again. So it's not like she's on the road every day, but it is, I think it's R21 in the walls and R26 in the ceiling and 30 in the floor. So yes, it is below freezing outside right now. The snow is about knee deep. It's the middle of winter. This window is wide open. The curtain is just keeping the light from blowing the camera out. And my little wood stove is right there. And I am actually slightly sweating. That's why the window's open.
Yeah. That's really awesome. That's just a level of efficiency that I think most homes don't really have. And I've watched your video on your wood stove, and it's just like this little cute like thing, but it's super like it's what it's designed to do in something with that amount of space, and it seems like it works very well for you.
It does.
How much do you actually burn from the standpoint of time wise? Because I don't in my area I don't really burn that often. We're talking maybe December to, I don't know, April at the latest, and that's if we have a cold year. So I know it's a lot colder where you're at. So how does that compare as far as the consumption of wood cord wise? How many cords do you go through in a winter?
Well, it's pretty efficient because it does have only so many square feet of air to heat. And you do have to split the wood a lot smaller. The wood that goes in there is smaller than most people's kindling. So it might be about the same amount of splitting. But as far as total cords of wood, I've gone through about 1.25 cords to 1.5 cords, depending on the year. Some are a little colder, some are a little longer. But we're also burning wood from about... we sometimes light a fire even in the middle of summer, because even in the middle of summer here we get nights that frosts and freezes, but then you would just have like one evening fire or maybe a morning fire. We burn kind of more steadily from September, October to June-ish usually. And then some summer fires as well. So a lot of the times it's just fine to let the house cool off overnight, and then it'll be nice and cool and feel air conditioned in the middle of the day in the summer.
Right. How many cords do you go through though in that amount of, because you only like don't burn for like 4 months out of the year. It seems like you're
pretty much. I've only ever gone through 1.5 cords was the longest, coldest winter when I went through the most wood.
Yeah.
So,
that would actually probably be a lot, because I imagine you don't really need to burn that much to keep things warm there, right?
No, you only need a few sticks, and then I'll even have to let it, like I was actually hoping it would go out a little bit more before our interview time came up, because it's rather hot to sit right here at the moment. But I don't just keep feeding it continuously, because then I could make this whole house like a sauna quite
Yeah.
easily. It'd be
Right.
160 degrees or something in here. So you let it kind of die down. And that's part of heating with wood, is it's not this thermostat that's set precisely on one temperature. It stays there like, oh, it's a little hot. Let it cool down. Okay, it's starting to get a little cool. Let's put some more wood in. But yeah, it works really well. I actually kind of like those cycles that feel like a natural cycle of life. I like waking up in the morning and being like, oh, it's a little chilly. Let me get a sweatshirt on while I get the fire relit. Okay, now it's plenty warm. And yeah, I enjoy that.
Yeah. I think that's kind of what I really enjoy about your story, is that you're not somebody who decided because tiny houses became a fad. You were doing it before it was even really a thing, and you still do it to this day. So it's something that obviously you've chosen as a lifestyle, and I just think that that's kind of neat and unique to find. So I think that's what kind of draws me to your channel.
Well, thanks. Yeah, it's worked very well for me, and partially that's because a lot of the things I enjoy are outside. I like to garden, I like to shovel snow, go snowshoeing, photograph wildlife, go hiking and backpacking. None of those things require house space. So for the activities I like, I only need a certain amount of space in a house, and then because I'm not spending much time or money or effort, building and maintaining and repairing and cleaning, a large house space, it gives me more freedom and time to go do the other things I'd rather be doing. And we
Yeah.
probably won't live in here forever. With two people, it's a little more crowded. I did build this specifically to fit me and all of my stuff and nobody else. And it worked really, really great for that. And with two people, it's a little more snug. So we are hoping to build a small house. My husband actually does building. That's what he's done professionally for many years. So we'll be doing that ourselves and building something along the range of 600 square feet, hopefully. So still not big compared to a lot of houses, but a little bigger than this.
Yeah, that'll probably be a big change for you guys. I mean, that's like it's almost like tripling your space now, right?
Pretty much.
Yeah. So you have a loft up above where you sleep up above, and the downstairs consists of your kitchen and
These little stair drawers right behind me go up to the sleeping loft. And yeah, kind of behind me, you can see the kitchen area. And behind the camera, where you can't see it, is the little couch and the front door and the spot to hang coats and put your boots and all that kind of stuff. And
right.
there's lots of storage in the kitchen. There's storage in the drawers. There's storage under the couch. There's bookshelves kind of up high up against the edge of the ceiling. And yeah, it's worked pretty well. My husband has more stuff, but a lot of his is tools and so on for his trade. So most of that is also not house stuff. And we did build him a shop, so he has room to put those things in.
Right. Yeah. One of the big themes, I guess, or kind of really what I try to bring out in these types of conversations with people is just, I'm very committed to the idea of self-reliance, and building more freedom and liberty into our lives. And, your lifestyle seems to me like it provides that in a lot of respects, because, you are so autonomous, right? You're completely off grid, are you not?
Yes, this tiny house always has been. We did recently run grid power, because it was already on the property, into my husband's shop, because he has some big power tools that are easier to use with that. But we are both very much on the same page that it's still not connected to this house at all. And that we never want the basic things of life, being warm, being fed, having water, being able to go to the bathroom. We don't want any of that to ever rely on the grid. If there is some grid power, and it's pretty cheap in our area, and that provides some extra luxuries, and it's working fine, but everything else is going to work whether that exists or not, for sure. But yeah, it does provide a lot of, I think some people would feel very tied down, because it kind of depends how you want to look at it. I think it provides me a lot of freedom and flexibility, but some people might feel like that they are very tied down. If they don't put wood in that wood stove, then the house is cold. Eventually, if you don't fill the water tank, no more water comes out of the spigot when you go to the sink. Eventually, if you don't empty the toilet, it's full and you can't go to the bathroom anymore. But for me, I think it does provide a great deal of freedom because I just have to do those things. And I would way rather be splitting firewood and watching the chickens and an eagle fly overhead and, an elk walk by than working for somebody else at a job somewhere else in order to pay a bill so that my thermostat just stays at 70 degrees year round. So it depends a little how you want to look at it. You could look at it as being very tied down to more physical, manual, regular chores. But for me, I think it provides a great deal of freedom because those are the things I would rather be doing anyway. And I'm not tied to needing to do anything else most of the time.
Yeah, it's actually super inspiring to me. What's up, Spags? I see you in the chat there, buddy. It's super inspiring because a lot of us grew up a different way, and I don't know to what extent you grew up in your upbringing, but a lot of us grew up under the system, and the system encourages us to keep on that hamster wheel, and when you go outside of the system as you've done, it just kind of detaches you from that, and there's just a certain level and an amount of freedom, I think, from the standpoint of peace of mind, at least the way that I'm currently thinking in my life. But again, that's not the way that I chose initially. I got like the bigger house, the job, the thing, and that's the way I was raised, and I think a lot of people were raised. But it's inspiring to see somebody who is doing something in your regard. That freedom is just built right in because you have so much time on your own, to do things that you want to do, and that's a certain element of freedom, I believe.
Yeah, for sure. I probably did grow up a little bit outside the system in some areas. My parents lived in a bigger house. There was 9 people in my family growing up, and we did have, power and such, but they also did a lot of things that would have been less normal at that time. I was homeschooled the whole way through school, as were all my siblings. That wasn't that common that many decades ago. Of course, before that, it was what everyone did, but not at that particular point in history in this part of the
Right.
world. And we did have a wood stove when I was growing up, and my parents, I never thought of them as, preppers or anything, but we always had a lot of stuff we produced ourselves just because that was what everyone did. I grew up in a pretty conservative, plain community like Amish, Brethren, Mennonites, those kinds of things. And everyone had a big garden. Everyone had lots of children. Everyone had some amount, even if you weren't running a commercial farm, everyone had some chickens or a goat they milked or a cow or, that kind of thing. So with everything I did grow up gardening and so on, and everything we grew, you grew enough potatoes to last you for the whole year because there weren't going to be more potatoes until they grew again next year and so on. So that was all normal things that I just grew up doing. And I like that. And now I do even more of that than my parents did.
Yeah, very cool. Very cool. I guess I would be remiss if I didn't ask what FY NYTH actually means. What does that mean?
It's Welsh for my nest. I was trying to pick a name for my tiny house when I first bought her and had no idea anyone else would ever be interested, or I might have picked something more easily pronounceable and spellable, and more commonly known. But it's old Welsh for my nest, and that's pretty much what the house has been. It's my little nest that I snuggle in very cozily for quite a few years now.
Yeah, that's neat. I guess being off grid, you have to manage your own power. How much power do you actually generate maybe in a day? How many kilowatts do you produce in a day? And then, how much as far as consumption is concerned? You've got a pretty small system. I've
A
seen it.
very small system. Yeah, I was gonna say I don't even think I've ever tried to count it in kilowatts. I have 400-watt panels out there, and I've had the same system for all 9 years I've been in the house. So technology has improved and changed a good bit. No one buying a small solar setup today would buy the exact parts and components I bought then because everything has improved, and I think you can get way more power for way less money now, but it's still working, and so that's still what I'm doing. So there's 400 watts of solar panels out there, and that on a sunny day here can produce a good bit. At this high elevation, we get, on sunny days, we get a lot of sunshine and very intense sunshine. But also all winter, we get a lot of days like this where it's gray and overcast and or snowing all day. So there are days when I, at this time of year, especially when I get hardly any power at all, that goes into a little battery bank that's got 555 amp hour batteries in it. And they're, again, older ones, so you're not supposed to discharge them the whole way, or it's very hard on their lifespan. So I'm pretty much only using the top 20% of that power. The system has worked out really well for what I've got set up here because I don't use power for much. I mostly use it for keeping the laptop charged, charging camera batteries, a few lights, and the fridge would be the main power draw because pretty much everything else works without power. And so that setup has worked. There are times in the winter where I have to fire up a generator and top the batteries back off if there's too many thick, snowy days in a row. But yeah, it works. I have to do a lot of calculating to figure out kilowatts. I don't even think it produces kilowatts, basically. It produces a tiny amount of power that gives me a few luxuries that I think are substantially nice compared to having no electricity at all. But nothing big in the house runs on electricity. The heat is wood, the stove is, the kitchen range is propane, the water heater's propane. I even don't use the electric lights that much just because I like the glow of the light from the wood stove or from candles or lamps, things like that. So power use is pretty limited here. If you show up for vacation and you brought your hair dryer, it's not going to turn on.
Wow. Yeah, that's bare bones right there. That's a big departure from, I think, what most people are accustomed to, yeah, it's, again, inspiring to see that those sort of things aren't necessary. That's one of the things that, like, when you go and you start getting into backpacking, you realize, do I really need those things? And the more you get into it, the less stuff you realize that you actually need when you're out there to be comfortable. And so I think that there's a big, I guess, determining wants versus needs when it comes to kind of in your lifestyle, right? I mean, there are things that you're forced to realize, I don't really need these to be happy necessarily. And on the flip side of that, a lot of people wind up building their life on things that they want, convincing themselves that they are things they actually need.
Yeah, and if you have things you want and you do whatever you need to do to have things you want, then that's great. But yeah, I'm sure you guys are familiar with this. The further you walk with things on the back, on your back, the more miles you cover that way, the more you think very hard about what do you actually even want if you've got to carry it around with you, because that takes some effort. And even if daily life doesn't require packing everything I own around on my back, to some degree, I'd look around and I see a lot of people who really are doing that. They're packing around, kind of mentally or emotionally or financially on their back, all of this stuff, because they've got to pay for it, make mortgage payments, make other payments, fix it, maintain it, clean it, whatever. And if that is what you want, that's great. I've never felt like everyone should live exactly this way in exactly this space. But I hope people stop and think about, do I actually want this? And is this worth the trade-off? And for some people, it is. That is what they want. But if it's not, then I hope you take the time to think, what do you actually want to do with your life? Is it more than just maintaining stuff? And if so, what is it? What steps do you need to take to get there? Because I didn't always have this much free time. When I first bought this house, I didn't have the cash to buy it outright. I was able to do an RV loan through our local credit union because legally it's considered an RV. And I had a 15-year loan, and I pretty much worked day and night, put every single penny that I didn't need for food into paying that off, and paid it off in 5 years, and now own the house free and clear and back out of debt. And my husband and I were able to combine our savings and buy this little acreage for cash, so we don't have any bills and payments. So now I'm a lot more free to spend my time splitting the wood and gardening and taking care of the chickens and canning and going foraging and all that stuff. But for a few years there, I was working all of the time to be able to pay for this to make that possible. So I hope people don't look at me or whoever else when they're further down that road and say, oh, I just want to do what I want every day and I'm going to start today. If you can, that's great. But you may have to put in some years of doing things you don't really want to do to be able to get to that point. But I hope you think about what that is and what do you need to do to get there before you get to the end of your life. And I get a lot of messages from folks who are considerably older than me that say things like, I just wish I had, something along the lines. I wish I'd done something different. Now I'm old or I'm dying or I'm sick or I can't. And I wish I'd done different things with my life. And that's kind of sad to me because I hope most of us get to the end of our lives, whenever that are, thinking that for the most part, I spent my life on things that I'm glad I spent it on.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's constantly something that, I continually reevaluate, because, you have a larger property, you have a larger house, stuff shows up, and then over time you realize, like you're looking around going, man, where'd all this stuff come from? Well, a lot of it's come from the things that you wind up purchasing. And that goes back to that want versus need. And I think that if a lot of people were to take time rather than just, pushing the buy now button on Amazon, but maybe waiting a week or waiting 2 weeks and then seeing if they still want it, there'd be a lot less of that clutter, about. But, yeah, everybody's different in how they want to spend their life and what makes them happy. So I'm not here to suggest in any way that, what I'm considering or the way that I'm thinking is the way others should think. But like I say, I just think that it's very inspiring to see someone like yourself who is setting that example for people to say, hey, look, this is something that, is actually attainable and achievable. And you're showing it in a way that, is reality. So I appreciate that.
Oh, good.
I see there, Spag said he went from 75 pounds to down to 35 pounds on his bug out bag over the years. And I think that goes back to what I was saying with the backpacking, because I had that same transition where you first start out and you've got all this stuff and you got stuff hanging off your pack and, and then you go out there and you're able to walk maybe 8 miles and you're just totally broke off by the end of the day. And then you start reevaluating, hey, is this something I actually need? Or is it just something that, I'm convinced myself that I want? So that's a good exercise in want versus need, is if you go out and you start getting into, backpacking or, long distance or otherwise, and you'll realize I didn't really need all that stuff. That was just stuff I told myself I needed,
Yeah, and if at the end of the day, after walking a lot of miles, you haven't used that thing for anything, it pretty quickly becomes really easy to be like, I'm not hauling that around anymore. That's stupid.
Right. Yeah, there are, generally speaking, like with backpacking, there are those luxury items, that we've convinced ourselves that we need. And I'm all about that. There's certain things that, like, yeah, I could save myself 3.2 ounces on the pillow that I bring, but let me tell you what, I sleep really good with that pillow. And it's nice to have at the end of the day. So that's one of my luxury items. And, everybody's got to have that. You can't just totally like pull everything out of your life, so.
Yeah, you just got to figure out what those things are for you that actually provide a lot of benefit to be worth the time or the cost or the energy or whatever the situation requires to have them.
Yeah, 100%. So gardening must be a real challenge for you. What zone are you in there in Wyoming?
Well, we are in about a 3A or B. It depends what map you look at, whether you go in this area, there's so many little microclimates. Depends if you go a few hundred feet one way or another.
Yeah.
But what I try to explain to people, because I get all the time, people be like, I live in a zone 3 and I grow this thing just fine. Growing zone has to do with what the coldest temperature is that it gets on the coldest day. Now that will affect what apple tree will grow here, because that tree grows year round. What that means almost nothing for is annual vegetables you grow in the summer. What means the most for them is how many frost-free growing days you have. So like where my parents live in southern Pennsylvania, I think they have like 160, 165 or something generally expected days between the last frost in the spring and first frost in the fall. We don't have that. We technically grow what most people would consider a winter garden in the middle of summer, because we do get frost and freezes very regularly, sometimes every night in a row through the middle of summer. Occasionally snow flurries. One time there was a foot of snow on the 4th of July. That was a bit unusual, but so everything I do is pretty much set up to be what many people could do as winter gardening. We grow cold hardy stuff, things that can take frost and freezes. Every garden bed has a frost cover that I can easily roll on and off, because I use them all summer long to keep in a little bit of extra warmth and so on. And we're still able to produce a good bit of food. The garden bed space we've got right now is only 600 square feet, and with no official growing zone or no official growing season there in the summer, we still grow over 600 pounds of produce in the past year. So that maybe will inspire somebody else who lives somewhere way warmer with what you could probably do in the middle of your winter, which is much like my summer.
Right. Yeah, no doubt about it. It does not get that cold where I'm at. I mean, our winter storms typically come through at 40 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's pretty warm in comparison to what a lot of people deal in the Midwest or, higher elevations and, elsewhere. So we have a very temperate climate, and our growing season is continual. Essentially, you can grow a nice winter garden, a nice summer garden, and through the spring. So we have it pretty good in that regard. So what is your length of growing season that you deal with there? What would you say?
I generally plant things the minute the snow is off the ground, because I'm not waiting for a final frost because we don't get one. So that's usually sometimes the very end of April, often sometime in May, that I'm putting seeds and such into the ground. And right away, using those frost covers to cover them, we simply don't grow things that die easily with frost. So we don't grow tomatoes and sweet corn and watermelons. We grow almost all the leafy things, cabbage, broccoli, all kinds of lettuces. All the root things tend to grow really well in the cold. So beets, carrots, onions, garlic, potatoes, white potatoes of various varieties. Sweet potatoes don't like frost at all, unfortunately, because I love sweet potatoes. Peas do pretty well. Beans, like green beans, some years we get a warm enough spell that we actually get to pick some green beans and eat them. But some years we get so many frosts back to back that they don't produce anything. Some years we get enough warm enough spell to get a few zucchini before the plants freeze. Some years not at all. So I mostly stick with growing the things that I know will pretty reliably year after year handle the kind of conditions that we get here. And that works pretty well. But yeah, there's things that we just don't grow. We hope to maybe one day get a greenhouse put up here and be able to have a little longer growing season and be able to do some of those other things. But at the moment, that's what we grow, and it does provide a good bit of food for the year.
Yeah, cool. Do you save your own seed?
For the things that will fully ripen a seed before they freeze to death, we do. So that is somewhat limiting. Like even sweet peas, I've never had. I have a long enough season that they're still producing fresh peas to pick and eat when everything freezes and starts snowing in the fall. And so I'm not really able to save my own seed because they don't have time to like fully mature out to something that would germinate on the plant. But for anything that does, we do. Well, replant our own potatoes, our own garlic cloves. I'm able to save seed from various lettuces or strawberry spinach, things like that. But there are some things I just have to buy because we just don't have enough time for a plant to make a mature seed that will reproduce.
Sure. So you've got some chickens that are some cold hardy chickens, from what I understand. What breed are those, and how do they work for you?
They work really well. We have Icelandic chickens, which, as you can probably gather from the name, came from a very cold part of the world. I don't think they're, like most things, they're not the perfect fit for everyone. I think they are just about the perfect fit for us and our situation. They are extremely tough little birds. I think they're fairly rare heritage land race breeds, so they were just selected for the best birds for those conditions. Over about 1,000 years from when Vikings brought jungle chickens from somewhere else to Iceland, and then they were pretty much genetically isolated there for about 1,000 years. And so they're significantly genetically different from almost all the other modern breeds out there. But they're very cold hardy. They're kind of a medium to small chicken. They lay pretty well right through the winter, 3 short days. We don't do any supplemental light or anything. They are free to, free range out in the snow. They don't go nearly as far in the snow as they do in the summer.
Mm.
They make very tasty little extra roosters. They do still have their natural instincts. We have mamas that go broody. This summer we hatched our own chicks. Plus we had a mama chicken who raised a bunch of ducks for us. When our mama duck decided she didn't care about sitting on her eggs anymore, a chicken took over and hatched them. So we end up with, of course, eventually spare roosters, and they make like a 2.5, 3 pound dressed bird. So it's not large, but they're also almost free because they hatch here and they run around the property eating bugs and weeds and stuff all summer, and then we butcher them in the fall. And so they have been a really, really good fit for us. They are a breed that likes to free range and have some space. They're fairly unhappy, I think, if you keep them in a small coop all the time. Some breeds are quite content with that, but they're also very, very good at finding their own food and going through the compost piles. There's some Icelandic word I'm sure I cannot pronounce properly that is another name they go by, that's basically heap chickens, because they will go through everyone's compost heaps and find their own food. And they produce a medium egg, so a little smaller than what you would get if you buy a grocery store large egg. But considering they're about the third the size of most egg-laying breeds, and they're producing almost the same size of egg and eating way less feed, they just work very, very well for us.
Yeah, it's really good when you can find animals that are, that work well within your climate, and then also have the ability to convert feed. I mean, we've got some birds that do really well for us. They have an excellent feed conversion ratio where, I mean, we don't feed them that much, and they just pump eggs out. They're just machines. So when you find those birds, or you find that livestock that just does well with those minimal inputs, I think that's something that gives you a certain level of freedom, because you're not necessarily tied to the feed store as much. You're either able to feed them from waste streams you get off of your own property, or they're just much more adaptable and much hardier. So that's kind of neat to hear about those particular birds.
Yeah, and I think it's key to wherever you live to look for stock that are either local to your area or from another very similar climate, because I'm sure they would not be the ideal chickens if you live in Florida or something. I don't think they deal well with the heat stress. But they do really well here. And of course, this is how over time we got so many heritage breeds, because people live in all kinds of different places and climates around the world. And after, sometimes hundreds or thousands of years of selectively, choosing an animal that does really well there, I think it's nice to keep that alive versus everyone in the whole planet, no matter where you live, just raising Cornish cross birds, because sure, they convert the smallest amount of feed into the biggest chunk of meat the most rapidly. But they would still be more expensive for us per pound, even though they make a bird you butcher in whatever 6, 7, 8 weeks, versus our heritage little roosters run around for 20, 21, 22 weeks. But we don't we hardly put any food into them, and they still make meat for us. So
Yeah.
I think it's nice to keep all those different heritage traits that are more specialized to different areas, if you are in the kind of area that breed is really built for.
Yeah, and that's good to hear that they're also broody as well. That's a trait that I look for, because there's nothing wrong with getting them from the hatchery, but if you can't get them from the hatchery, it's kind of nice to know you can, hatch them on your own property. So that's something that they get a little bit of street cred with me, a little bit of bonus points for having that broody characteristic. I'll keep those ones around a little bit longer.
Yeah, we have some very good mamas, and it wasn't every single hen, but we had, let's see, last summer we had 14 hens, and 5 of them went broody. A couple of last ones we actually just had to break because it was getting too close to fall, and I was like, I'm sorry, ladies, I don't really want little teeny baby chicks when the blizzards start. But so we had about a third of our hens wanted to raise chicks, and all the ones that we left sit earlier in the summer did successfully do just that, whether they were chickens or ducks.
Yeah, very cool. What other livestock do you raise there on your property?
We have Swedish ducks, and they're very, very tough and cold hardy as well. They lay some pretty good eggs. We haven't yet found we really like their meat, so that's a breed that it's up in the air. We might try some different duck breeds and see if there's one that we like better, because I'd like to have the same setup with them where they just raise their own and then we eat the extra boys, and have them for eggs. Other than that, we have a couple cats that manage the rodents and a couple dogs that are, companions and patrol and keep the hawks and eagles out of the, yard and stuff like that. But we don't have any bigger livestock at the moment. We're surrounded by cattle ranching and so on, but with only 3 acres, depending where you live, you can certainly have a cow on 3 acres. With 3 acres, that's only not winter for 4 months a year. We'd have to buy a lot of hay if we were going to have any bigger animal here. So we've decided for now, at least, to stick with the smaller things. Oh, and we have honeybees, if you count those as livestock. So we have, 100,000 something head of bees out there.
100,000 head. I like it. Yeah, that's one of the things that I've really taken a focus on really since we've been on this property. We've actually been here 22 years on our place, but
Nice.
I've always been looking at trying to cut down on the feed inputs and trying to manage the property that I have here so that the property itself is largely supporting the livestock. I think a lot of times people get livestock onto their property because they have some property, and that's great. You can get all different kinds of livestock, but you need to find livestock that is suited to your property, not necessarily the other way around. And so that's one of the things that I've continually tried to evaluate. And we're currently making a transition from having less beef cows because of just the lack of rain. We've got lack of rain, and then we've also got high feed costs, so it just doesn't pencil out at a certain point, to say, well, I've always done it this way, or this is what I want. You have to do kind of what makes sense. And so a lot of times.
Oh, there you are again. Blinked out for a sec.
Looks like I lost you for a moment.
Um,
But yeah. I just think that it makes sense to really continually evaluate your property and get the animals on the property that suit the property rather than, just saying, well, I want to have this, but yet I'm going to spend 3 times as much, at the feed store to have these animals, and at some point, you have to really evaluate that, or at least that's the way that I look at it. So.
Yeah, because we've certainly talked about, could we raise a steer? Could we raise some lambs, something like that? And for a couple months we could, but then what do we do the rest of the year? We'd have to buy a lot of feed. And even with our chickens and ducks, we're still buying some feed. That's one of my projects over the next couple of years, as I want to work at being able to produce more of what we feed them here. Sunflowers grow pretty well here, and they love sunflower seeds. And I've never tried this, but
Did I lose you again?
no,
You're back.
I don't know why it's doing that. I haven't had any drops in the last few interviews, and my connection looks good on this end. But anyway, hopefully we can produce some sunflower seeds here, and of course they eat kitchen scraps and so on. And even my husband likes to fish, and he's got another friend who fishes, and he'll save all the fish heads and guts and spines and stuff like that, and we'll freeze them and then just chop them up with an axe. And the chickens love eating that. It's an excellent protein source.
Yes.
And yeah, if we can grow a little wheat patch here, that would be fun to play around with. See if we can put up one little bucket of wheat for feeding back to the birds through the winter. That's all projects I'm working on, because we think much the same as you. See how much of it that we can actually do totally, close the loop here without having to go buy stuff from outside.
Yeah. We last year I grew some sunflower and corn for the chickens, and I didn't produce as much as I would have liked, but it's something. So that was kind of my thought, in that project, and I'm going to continually expand that this year and see if I can grow a little bit more. But
Nice.
Primarily, that space was something that I was trying to get the soil amended in a right way so that I could get that planted in. The soil itself was a little immature at that point. I think it's going to be a lot better this year. I've planted a 10 seed mixed cover crop in there, and it's just killing it right now with all the different things that are coming up, the Austrian winter pea and the daikon radish and a bunch of clovers. Nice. And yeah, so I think that particular patch is going to be really good this year as far as what it'll be able to produce for us, whether I plant something similar in there or I decide to go with some other kind of crop. But it's just a small little area, and I've actually covered it so that birds can't get in there and just, because we have house sparrows. I don't know if you have house sparrows there, but they are a very invasive little bird that will just eat all of your tender. So if you try to grow, leafy stuff, or you try to grow carrots or stuff like that, I have to actually cover that, because when it first comes up, I would have to plant like a quarter acre of it to get ahead of them. Or in a smaller, type of a thing, I have to keep it covered, or they'll just come in and just get that tender shoot and kill it all off. So,
we have a bunch around here, but I haven't really seen them attack the garden. But maybe that's because my frost covers are on it so much of the time. They did used to try to dive in the poultry yard and steal grain from them, until our one cat caught one of them finally after much stalking. And that's really deterred them. I haven't seen the little birds back in the chicken yard again. They decided that was a bad idea.
Yeah, that house sparrow, it's pretty interesting if you look at the history behind that, as far as when it was introduced into North America. And there was like 50 birds brought over from Europe or something around the 20s, I think, in the Depression era. And they wound up starting to reproduce. And now they're almost in every state in the United States, but they're the most. Millions. What's that?
By the millions.
Oh yeah, they are the most prolific. Like, I don't know what they're called, a songbird or whatever, but they're actually an invasive species, and they're the one species that they don't discourage you from eradicating, because of the fact that they actually exterminate. They target and exterminate native birds. So if you have native birds on your property, like that come into nest, cardinals or bluebirds or whatever, come into nest, they'll actually go in and kick the eggs out, steal the nest, or kill the birds and kill the little young ones and steal the nest. So
they've actually done some interesting research on that. And even some of the bird researchers who really hate them have had to admit that really mostly when you end up with all house sparrows and the others die off, it has more to do with that us people did things that killed all the other birds, and house sparrows are one species that's particularly good at getting along with the things we do.
Yeah.
But that they don't actually kill the other birds. But our property here is an abandoned hayfield that had been ignored for many years and neglected, and has some major issues. And we have a big problem with invasive quackgrass, which is my least favorite plant on the whole planet. Makes it very hard to grow anything else because it will choke out everything. But we've also planted a lot of trees and bushes, and most of them are teeny tiny right now. But we're already starting to see, despite having house sparrows around, more of the native birds, the chickadees and the little warblers and the nuthatches and stuff coming in wherever there is some tree cover. So hopefully in a few years this will look a lot different. We'll have a lot more of those around.
Yeah, there's they seem to come and go. Different species. We saw a bunch of different neat birds come in last year that I had never seen before, and then they started really like coming in by the dozens. And I was they were just a really pretty bird, like bright yellow with red breasts and a kind of a black cape. And yeah, they were just a really cool looking bird. So definitely want to encourage the wildlife around here to keep populating.
For sure.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. Off-grid living, it's not for everybody, and I'm sure that there's been a lot of things that you've learned along the way. What would you say is kind of maybe some of your biggest challenges, or something that you didn't actually anticipate that wound up being one of your biggest challenges?
The first thing I probably learned is I don't recommend jumping into living fully off grid right at the beginning of a Wyoming winter. That is what I ended up doing, because that's when our lease was up and I was about to be homeless. And anyway, that's how it worked out. Kind of like moving into a tiny house. I didn't have like this years long goal in life of moving into a tiny house. It was a thing that worked for the situation I was in and has worked very well. But off grid was kind of the same. I didn't have like a lifelong ambition. I've always liked being more free and independent. So I definitely like that aspect of it. But I didn't have a lifelong ambition to go off grid. It was now I had a tiny house. I had an offer of a really sweet spot to park it on the side of a mountain on this ranch. And there was no way that grid power was going to be there. The closest line was a long ways away. And, running it over to there was going to be, $1 million or something. So that was just flat out not an option. So it was like, okay, well, off grid is what I'm doing, I guess. And yeah, most of the first learning curve, I guess the first thing that really surprised me is I thought if something is a propane appliance, like a propane kitchen range or whatever, this means it will work if you have propane, regardless of whether or not you have electricity. And I rapidly learned that almost all of them require power for some kind of control or switch or something, and won't work at all if you don't have any power. I learned that on day one when I fully expected to turn on my heater and be able to cook, even if I needed to use a headlamp or a flashlight or a lamp or a candle or whatever for lighting. And that day I learned, none of this will turn on without power. So I didn't even have any of my solar stuff yet. So it was like, well, none of this will come on if I don't have the generator running. Now, there are some appliances you can get that do not do that. I've actually switched the like the kitchen range. The little igniter is powered by a little 9-volt battery, which lasted like 3 years, I think, before I had to replace it. And the rest of it actually runs on propane. But if you do not specifically seek out appliances that actually do not require power to run, even if their main source is something else, they probably won't turn on if there's no power to them. And that was just something I was totally unaware of. That's true for a lot of heaters, air heaters, water heaters. I think even a lot of propane fridges and stuff. There are options out there that actually don't require any power. But if you don't seek that out, you probably will get one that is not the case for. After figuring that out, it was more just having to develop a routine of filling things, turning things on or off in kind of a regular schedule, because it felt like for the first little bit, everything always got to be an emergency because I wasn't used to this yet. It was like, I'm trying to finish washing my dishes and my water tank is completely empty and it's dark and it's, 20 below zero outside. That kind of sucks. Or, now my batteries are down to the level where they really need the generator run and it's in the middle of a blizzard and it's 10 o'clock at night. And my alarm that warns me they need charging is screeching and I really wanted to just go to sleep and deal with this later. But kind of all that, it just took some time in getting used to it to know, okay, this is probably getting low, fill it now. This is a convenient time and temperature and weather to do this. Let's put water in there now. And so now pretty much none of that stuff gets to be an emergency, but that just took some getting used to all the systems when they're not controlled by just flipping a switch or setting a thermostat.
Right. Yeah. So you haul your own water to your, you're not plumbed to water. You haul your water to your tiny home.
Yes. So for all the years it was in that clearing, I actually went over to a neighbor's well. Well, it was kind of on the same ranch, but a couple miles up the road, and just filled like 5 and 7 gallon water jugs and poured them in from the outside of the house. There's a fill that's much like any RV, freshwater fill spot. And then there's an internal tank that's back there kind of in the dead corner behind the sink under the counter. And so I'd fill that and then I'd have water for quite a while. When you carry all your water by hand, you rapidly become very conscious of every single drop you use for everything. But I only fill water about every couple weeks. Now we actually have, and it's one of the reasons we bought this property, we have gravity fed water coming from a mountain spring above us onto the property. It is currently just at a yard hydrant out there. That's the way it was when we bought the place. Eventually that will be plumbed into the house we're building, and we may eventually run a line out to where the tiny house is parked here. But we have been busy with other projects and none of that has happened yet. So now I'm just, instead of driving to somebody else's well to fill it up, I'm just filling the tanks at our spigot in our yard, putting them in a sled at this time of year, sliding them down to the other end of the property and pouring them in. So still doing water by hand. That's one of the things I'd like to eventually not do for the whole rest of my life.
Right. What about your capacity? What is your capacity, tank holding capacity there?
There's a 10-gallon propane water heater tank. So I get 10 gallons there, and then it's a 35-gallon cold water tank. So if it's all filled up, I got 45 gallons.
Nice.
So that if you're cautious with your usage and you use it for cooking and drinking and washing some dishes, and for many years I never showered. There is a shower in the little bathroom that's kind of behind the stairs here, but I used it as storage and just went elsewhere, like to the gym, to shower because it was too lazy to carry that much water.
Right.
Now we do use the shower some, but we still try to make them pretty brief showers.
What do you do with your gray water?
It drains. So I kind of feel like I have two answers for all this stuff, because I have the way I did it for 7 years and then the way I'm doing it now because of the move in locations. So for the first bunch of years, it drained right onto, I was on a very rocky hillside on the side of the mountain, and it drained into the pine trees and wild berry bushes directly behind the house, filtering through many, many feet of rock, and helped water those. And it just drained, like literally fell freely out of the pipe under the house onto there. And the ground is so dry here and drains so well, and we have such an arid climate, it never even made a puddle on the surface in years of doing that. Of course, I wasn't using many gallons either, but anyway, here we have some more people using it, and therefore a little more water. And so my husband actually dug out a drain field with, I forget what they're called. They look like these big plastic, kind of like a half barrel that you dig a hole, you make it flat, you set that in, and then you backfill it, so you have this open kind of tunnel underground. Mm-hmm. And now the water goes into that and those plastic, I know they have a name, but I can't think what it is. They're all perforated, and so that just lets the water filter out through that whole area. So at the moment it's watering the lawn. I doubt it's making, I mean, the yard is mostly clover and weeds, but I doubt it's even making it as far as the fruit or bushes or the nut trees we planted, but hopefully it'll help a little bit with that.
Yeah, cool. Yeah,
and of course we have a composting toilet set up, so there is no black water going into that system.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that composting toilet. So people, like, at least that was my thought prior to listening to, the episode on the survival podcast where you were talking about it. I had the impression, it was a little different than the way you described it. So maybe just describe, your system that you currently have set up, and, what maybe were some of your concerns going into it that maybe you don't have now because of things you've learned about it.
Yeah, that is one. Unlike I'd rather not carry my water by hand forever, using a composting toilet is something I plan to do the rest of my life. That's, for us, that's not a temporary, I want to quit at some point measure. My main concern before I'd ever done it was the smell. You have a bucket of poop in your house that's going to stink. But if you're familiar at all with any kind of livestock management and permaculture or deep litter mulching, basically what we're doing is a deep litter system for human manure. And we have both a small commercial version of a composting toilet, a Nature's Head. That's what's in the bathroom here. It looks a little more like a normal porcelain flushing toilet. And then down in the shop and so on, and out in the woods, so you don't ever have to go far, we have several of just the 5-gallon bucket versions that my husband built, just a nice little box to sit over, and a toilet seat that goes on that. So we've used both of those. I almost think now that the bucket version is handier. So you sit down on a bucket version, you just sit down, do whatever you're going to do, take a scoop of sawdust or whatever cover material you have. A lot of people use sawdust. Some people use peat moss or shredded leaves or straw or something like that. We have a local cabinet maker who otherwise was just putting his bags of sawdust into the garbage can going to the landfill. So now we just take them for him. And just cover that deposit. So here's where it's working just like a deep litter mulch system in possibly your chicken barn or your cattle barn or whatever. There is no smell at all. I have now lived with a bucket of poop in my house for almost a decade, and that really is true. And then when it gets full, we just empty it into, we have a compost pile outside, much like all our other compost piles, and let it break down for a couple of years and then use it around trees, bushes. Some people aren't comfortable doing this, but I've been using it in the vegetable garden as well for quite a few years. With the commercial one, it actually has, the main difference is it has a urine diverter. So you get a bucket of pure urine and then a solids bucket. That's kind of nice to have because in the summer, urine is an excellent nitrogen fertilizer. So if you mix about 1 part urine with about 10 parts water, and I don't usually measure that precisely, I kind of splash them both in a bucket or a watering can. It's a spectacular fertilizer for everything in the garden, all the herbs, all the flowers, all of that kind of stuff. And on that one, it would be, I guess, a little bit more like doing your deep litter system with chickens or something that's going to turn it over. There's like a beater bar in the solids bin. So every time you make a deposit, you simply turn the little crank handle on the side and it kind of dumps it up underneath whatever is existing in there. Again, you can use sawdust, you can use peat moss. I found just for the smooth functioning, the beater bar, peat moss actually worked the best in there. I also did something that's not necessarily a manufacturer recommendation, and I put red wiggler earthworms right into that bin. And with just me using the toilet for many years, they broke down everything so quickly that I would go for 4 months or so before I'd need to empty the solids bin. And at that point, it was already so digested. It came out of there looking like rich potting soil. No smell, unless you had just taken a dump right before you emptied it. But otherwise, I could have grabbed a handful of that and sold it to you as premium, potting soil, and you would have never known the difference. And with the bucket version, we fill them up a little more rapidly. So I don't have worms in them. The worms are in the compost pile that we dump the bucket into.
Yeah, that's quite a system. Just think a lot of people aren't really exposed to it. They don't know. That sounds kind of gross. It sounds a little off-putting or whatever. But a lot of the things that people turn their nose up at are things that they haven't actually experimented with and had, the opportunity to see for themselves if it's actually the things that people say about it. So,
and I think a lot of people are they're grossed out by the idea. They're used to things going away. You hit the flush lever and it goes away. A lot of times what's happening with it is way more gross if you are aware of where the sewage goes or how it's treated. Now there's different systems, but in a lot of big cities, of course, that's going into some kind of recycling method where they're actually fishing all the chunky stuff out and either putting that in a landfill or using it as bio sludge on something else. And then, chlorinating and filtering and whatever the water, and that same water is coming back out of your tap and you're drinking it later, which actually seems a lot more gross to me. Plus, when you mix poop and pee and other stuff all in water, you get a big stinky mess. With this, you do not get a big stinky mess. You don't create sewage at all. You create compost, and it really isn't different than taking your horse manure, cow manure, chicken manure with their bedding, with whatever dry stuff that is, sawdust, wood shavings, straw, and it breaks down into this just beautiful soil, and you actually have a valuable product to use to fertilize your property rather than a toxic waste. But a lot of people with a lot of things in life are just very used to the idea of it goes away, and as long as it's out of sight, then they don't think about it anymore.
Yeah, 100%. Yep, you're 100% correct on that. Those red wigglers, they're good workers, aren't they?
They are.
Yeah, that's cool. Hey, do you live your life kind of in a like based on the circadian rhythm of sunlight and no sunlight, and you go to bed when it's dark and you get up when it's light, and because since you're managing your own power, is that typically how you run your day as far as?
Somewhat. I'd say we do sleep a little longer in the winter for sure when we're high enough in elevation and far enough north that we go from about 6 hours of sunshine about 8 hours of total daylight on the shortest day of the year to about 16 on the longest day. So we do get a pretty big swing, nothing like Alaska where you go from 24 to 0, but um, I definitely just find naturally that I want to wake up earlier in the summer when it's daylight earlier.
Hmm.
And but I can't say that we exactly go to bed right when the sun goes down, because midwinter that's like 4 in the afternoon. And I'd say we do start to wind down. You usually be done with outside projects at that point. And that's when I have time to catch up on photo editing or creating videos and such. And I do like sticking with as much natural light as I can while doing some of those things. So often I'll be sitting over there on the couch with just the light flickering from the wood stove and a candle or two, and my screen on my laptop actually turned the whole way down because otherwise it's blindingly bright. But I will work on things like that for quite a few hours after the sun goes down before we go to bed. But I think compared to a lot of people living with just, electric lighting and everything coming on and off, automatically or at the same times, we do find ourselves living, the days are more regulated by the season of the year and the weather and all of that, which I kind of like.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. Um, you do a lot of life or photography of wildlife. So what is a lot of that? Do you wind up selling that work, or is that more or less just for your personal enjoyment of doing it? Or do you have a business where you sell your wildlife photography, because your work's quite good?
Well, thank you. Yes, I do sell some of it. There are a lot of wildlife photographers out there. And so fortunately, I also do it just for my personal enjoyment, because if I was doing it solely for income, it would not be worthwhile. For sure. It's lovely whenever somebody buys a print or a, canvas to hang on their wall. And I love when I can share, even if you just follow me on MeWe or something, just the, photos of a lot of wild critters that live here that a lot of people aren't ever going to get to see in their lifetime. But I can't say that it's actually a profitable business. I've spent more on camera gear alone in my life than I've ever earned from selling photos. And that doesn't count any time invested into it. But I enjoy time in the woods, and I enjoy watching wildlife and tame life. I like watching our domesticated animals here as well. But that's just something I've always enjoyed. And it's definitely a hobby that is a lot of fun to do. I mean, I live here in the mountains in Wyoming, and there we have pretty much everything that lives in this continent and hemisphere, at least. We have wolves and bears and mountain lions and moose and elk and deer and, various owls and hawks and eagles and I don't know, tons of little things. So I do very much enjoy that.
Yeah. Yeah. It shows in the way that you present your content. And yeah, I enjoy the artistic aspect of it, and it's very peaceful and serene. And it's nice because you get to see what it is, kind of how you see it, because the photography is so vivid and good. So it's pretty good stuff.
I'm glad you like it.
Yeah. We're kind of going to wrap it up here, I think. If what I would like to know, though, from you, I actually put the links that you had sent me in the show notes. So your social media links and things like that, where people can get a hold of Ariel's channel. You guys should go check it out. It's pretty awesome. But is there anything that you want to leave with? Is there anything that you've got coming up for FY NYTH that you would want to have people interested in following you to see what you're doing?
Well, probably the next big project, which won't be till the snow melts here, will hopefully be starting on building our small house instead of the tiny house. Um, Other than that, I try to do, in addition to videos of wildlife, just kind of whatever projects we're working on, what we're doing in the garden, what I'm canning, what I'm cooking, what we're building. And I just like to share our ups and downs. And we planted that didn't work at all. We planted this and the quackgrass choked out all of those and killed them all. And so we're figuring this out. Or, we did this and this works really well, because I've learned so much in my life from, both people I've known in person, from my parents to extended family to the community I grew up in to various people I've worked with, that I feel like I've been really blessed to learn from a lot of people, a lot of useful knowledge, as well as reading books and other people's channels and podcasts and so on. I just don't want to be a dead end for all that information. I want to keep sharing things, and hopefully, not everyone wants to do all the same things or lives in the same climate or whatever, but hopefully some part of it is helpful for some people and maybe save somebody else a little trial and error. But though, as long as I'm able to do it, that's probably what there'll be more of. If you're interested in foraging or, hunting or doing your own butchering or raising your own animals, or, living in a fairly minimal space, or even I haven't really done any, I guess, instructional backpacking videos, but anytime I have time to go backpacking, I usually try to put something together of the pretty scenery. So there's a huge variety. I know that's not the way you're supposed to do it. You're supposed to focus on a topic and, gain a big audience, but was never my goal. It's just stuff I share that I find interesting or hope is useful. And if you like it, then I'm glad you're here. And if you don't, have a nice life doing something else.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Well, it's been great having you on and getting an opportunity to chat with you. I've never met you in person. But this is as close as I've gotten to that, and I've enjoyed the conversation, and I hope others will go and check out your channel and see what you have to offer, because I've been an avid consumer of your content, and appreciate you coming on.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah. All right, guys, we'll see you.